Welcome to Incomplete, a complete collector podcast. In this episode, I'm joined by Guy Stainthorpe and Dominic Chorney. Guy is a brand managing director of Corgi and the Corgi Model Club. A lifelong enthusiast of die-cast models, Guy turned his childhood passion into a career and now steers one of the most iconic model brands in the world. Dominic is an ancient coin specialist, author and auctioneer at Stanley Gibbons Baldwin's. He spends his day uncovering and selling some of history's most fascinating artefacts, and as we'll hear, also has a bit of a soft spot for Pokémon trading cards. This episode is shaped by a major new collector survey conducted by Hornby Hobbies Limited and Stanley Gibbons Baldwin's. The results reveal surprising truths about why we collect, how our collecting habits evolve over time, and the emotional triggers behind them. From nostalgic memories to rare finds, and from family influences to lifelong obsessions, we unpack the fascinating psychology and sociology of collecting. A quick note, we did have some small technical glitches during recording, so thanks for bearing with us. We hope you enjoy. So welcome back to another Incomplete episode. This month we're joined by Guy Stainthorpe and Dominic Chorney. Guy is brand managing director of Corgi and the Corgi Modeling Club. Ask him to make a short introduction of his backstory.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Yes, I actually joined Hornby quite recently. They're parent owner of the Corgi brand as a whole, and they recently purchased Corgi Model Club, which I set up about 4 years ago. And so that's my entry into the world of diecast and the world of Hornby. In terms of my relationship with diecast models and collecting, it goes all the way back to really when I was very, very young. So we can discuss that later.
Thanks very much. And Dominic Chorney. So Dominic is an ancient coin specialist, author and auctioneer.
Hi, Aaron. How's it going? I see you basically every day. So my job at Baldwin's is to buy and sell ancient coins, to value them, and then we do the sales as well. So I'm an auctioneer. I stand up on the rostrum and we auction off all these fantastic coins every few months. And yeah, it's good when your job is also sort of your hobby.
And we'll be diving into those ancient coins and your other collecting hobby, Pokémon, as we go through. So a little introduction to this episode of the podcast. It's underpinned by a large recent survey that was carried out between Hornby and Stanley Gibbons Baldwin's, two heritage brands, foundations of the UK collecting scene, and decided to get together and survey a few thousand avid collectors across the UK. Some incredible insights, more of which will be shared over the coming months. But one of the things that really came through quite powerfully was this collector's journey that a lot of collectors seem to go on. Invariably, there will be a trigger. They may start collecting early in early years, and we'll kind of dive into that again in a little bit more detail. They'll go through a growth phase where they acquire as many things as they possibly can, as quickly as they can, before they perhaps become a little more sophisticated, focus on a certain area, and as their disposable income perhaps increases, the amount of time they can focus on it changes throughout their life, they begin to right size, possibly releasing some of their collection that they've grown over the years and gradually becoming more and more focused. The inspiration that this created has driven us to launch a National Collectors Day, which we'll be announcing the detail of very soon, but something there that's designed to celebrate those that are involved in hobbies, from cars to coins to stamps and beyond. So the first stage that we dived into is triggers, and it's often hypothesized that some people are innately collectors, and we can all probably identify family members or friends with an insatiable desire to acquire items of interest. Is this something that you see within the Corgi Collectors Club, Guy?
Absolutely. I think there are two triggers. If I'm trying to sort of formalize the thinking around it, I think there's an internal response, and I think there's an external trigger response as well. So if you think about the first, for us, the personal experience can be triggered by something as just as simple as a good story that attracts your attention for the first time, or it can be a gift. And I think I saw in the survey that gifting was one of the big elements that drives people to start collecting. So I think that's from a personal point of view. External triggers, it can be a parent, a relative, or a friend that can bring you closer to a hobby that you wouldn't have otherwise thought about. So we know that's very, very closely related to things like stamp collecting, and I'm sure it's the same with die-cast as well.
And in the survey, we found that 60% of people started collecting before they were 24. And there was this one really lovely quote I have in front of me now, which is, as a Corgi Collectors Club member, I feel like I'm buying back childhood memories. I wish I hadn't given away my original Corgis in my teens, but I'm lucky enough now to easily buy all the models I want.
When we think about those original triggers, it can be started off by something as simple as a toy that you were given. I mean, from a personal experience, my first die-cast metal toy was a Concorde in BOEC markings, and that for me was one of my first kind of emotional triggers into the world of die-cast. It was just great, and I'll never forget it.
And Dom, on this note, how do you feel things are different between something like maybe a Corgi item which is almost designed inherently to be collectible, versus something like ancient coins where its design purpose was something very, very different?
I think that's a really good point. It's something I hadn't really thought about. I suppose with modern things like Corgi toys, or Corgi models, I should say, you get to decide how many are made. So you can do limited production runs, I suppose. You can do special editions and things like that. With ancient coins, you are limited by how many exist or how many were made at the time and how many have been found since. So I think we sort of don't really have any control at all, unless a big collection comes onto the market and sort of changes everything. And certain prices can go down, or sometimes things can become more sought after. So there's a bit of a difference there, but I think the thing you say with triggers, yes, everyone starts collecting coins in their youth, basically.
And will you find the same gap? So with regard to something like a Pokémon, which is probably encouraged during childhood, Corgi, which is the same, do you find the same profile where somebody may collect into their teens, stop, come back decades later? Or with coins, do you find that once it starts, it's fairly consistent across their collecting life?
I think it's the money thing. It's a slightly different type of collecting, I suppose, because a lot of young people will collect because their grandparents are encouraging them to collect, whereas kids who are collecting toys will have been given them for Christmas. So there's a bit of a difference there. And also, it's the money thing. It's someone grows up and then suddenly they have more disposable income. I'm not there yet, unfortunately. And then they can afford to buy all those things they couldn't afford when they were younger. But talking about triggers, I think it's interesting. It just come to my mind. Triggers you can be triggered, 40 years in the past, and then suddenly my grandma threw away all his Corgi toys, or gave away all of his old Corgi and Dicky toys. But it was only 10 years ago that he decided, well, there's a model shop nearby and they're selling historic models, antique toys. Well, I'm going to buy a few of the ones that I lost.
I think that's quite right. And I think what happens is, when you think of it, most of these collectible habits are started, as we've agreed, when people are much younger, and the survey shows that. Then they can go underground for a bit, they can go latent, and then they return later in life. And again, there's an emotional trigger or some kind of response that's come from a change of life circumstances or something like that. And I think we know this, and we see it time and time again in our data. And it can often be really the sign to us that it's a lifetime pursuit, actually, deep down. You can't get it out of your system, actually. And I think it's the collecting thing is a bug, As I'm sure we'll come back to that as well, but it's also the desire for escape, and I think we see a lot of things going on in people's lives where, if you have a busy career or something like that, and you just want to step back sometimes and look at something else, get away from the screen and actually think about something that's not screen time related. I think it's a really big drive as well. So that's one of the things I think that helps people think about things when they are at certain life stages, when, as you said, they've got the money, they've got the affluence. And that's a major trigger, I think, behind collecting and the range and the depth of collecting. But I think it's also a major physical factor as well.
Look at things like COVID. I mean, that people were bored.
Yeah.
They didn't have anything to do. So they I suppose they look back on what they used to do when they were younger, buying more coins or presumably I think Hornby did particularly well.
Yeah. Oh, Hornby did ginormously well, apparently. But it's a bit before my time there. But they had a COVID bump, as we saw it. And I certainly saw it when we launched the Corgi Model Club just at the end of COVID. And we had a heck of a good run. That's all I have to say. And it kind of stuck after that. Anthropologists know this. They know people collect all the way through different, civilizations, different cultures. But actually, I think the thing that really drives the range and the depth is affluence and time. So when you've got more time and more affluence, if you have a society that has more time, more leisure time, then you're going to see more people collecting as well.
And with an aging population and more time on our hands, kind of collecting's here to stay.
The Emperor Augustus, the most powerful and richest man in the world at the time, probably, he was a coin collector. And he had coins of Alexander the Great that were minted 350 years earlier than his reign. So it's really amazing. This collecting bug sort of just transcends time, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's very much in our it's in the DNA. I know it, and it's the same for women as well. It's just I think in society women have had less affluence and less time, and therefore they haven't been such big collectors.
It's a really interesting point because one of the things that we pulled out of the survey, and this is particularly prevalent in philately, over 50% of stamp collectors started before the age of 12. The majority of other collectors start before 24, but this is before the age of 12. And of those, there's this huge impact of a family member. And whilst we didn't break that down in the question, the comments that came alongside it always referenced father. So it was passed from father to son because, as you said, there's probably more free time. There was the affluence there a century ago. And that kind of, we're still seeing the back end of that now, but we are also seeing it, especially in modern collectibles, a much broader mix of people coming through into the hobbies.
And I think some people perhaps keep their collecting bug or habit and slightly concealed because people might think they're a bit strange or a bit odd.
Yeah.
But given that it's so widespread and so prevalent, I don't think people should be quite so shy about it.
Absolutely. I mean, we found 20 to 25% of the British population are collectors in some way, shape or form, with books and coins leading the charge there. But there are many, many other collections, from giant teapots through to ancient coins.
There's also fashions change as well. I mean, I'm not a watch expert particularly, but I know that nowadays women are wearing men's size watches. And so perhaps and again, an area watches really that was generally predominantly male collectors spread much more widely.
Another one of the themes that came through on the responses is watches seem to be related quite closely to events in time. So this collector DNA that we discuss absolutely seems to be a thing, but there will always be a trigger that sets that off. And if I look in front of me now, my first watch in my collection was my granddad's watch that he wore during the D-Day invasion. And there were actually several really, really similar comments to that, where this particular item is linked to a moment in time, as well as all those people that just started in childhood because it was part of their life or part of their hobby or part of their play.
Yeah, it's fun, isn't it? Because the whole idea of collecting, because I collect watches as well, so I've got a guilty secret there too. But I think the strange thing for me is that you get your fix and then you might go dormant again for a bit. And it might be triggered by lack of money because they can be heinously expensive. Or you've been sated for a bit, and you've had your fix. Yeah. And then you come back to something and you think, well, I wanted one with a black face. I've got one with a white face. So now what, And I think there's definitely a case of that with watch collecting. So you go through perhaps a more cyclical process because of the virtue of the expense of them. But with things that are perhaps more collectible, like stamps, where you can buy cheap and expensive, cheap by jowl, I think you're in a much more advantageous position just to keep pursuing your interest. And I can't see how this is how people build up stamp collections of 50,000 items, because they just can't leave it alone. They go into a post office and think, oh, do you know what? I've got to buy some stamps today, but I might as well just pick up those as well, And I think it's just a symptom of the process. But I think it should be celebrated. I don't think we should be, society should let it be more recognised and more, because it is so widespread, and be more celebrated, I think, because it is fun. It really is fun.
And that's something with coins, I think. I'm going to name drop some companies, but the Royal Mint is producing more commemorative coins than they ever have.
It's interesting we mentioned coins in there. So it basically emerged that books and coins are incredibly popular. Both of them well over, if we kind of extrapolate our numbers, 4 or 5 million people in the UK collecting each of those categories, which is an enormous number. Do you think there's a difference between admitting, if we want to call it that, being a collector of a book or an ancient coin, which feels inherently grown up and sophisticated, versus I collect this thing that actually we all associate with our childhood?
Well, yes, and I think I had the pleasure of working for the Folio Society for several years, and their positioning as a business really was about creating very fine editions of, some of the world's greatest literature going back to Shakespeare and stuff like that. And I think they recognized the appeal of books. And of course, when people have a library, it actually becomes a source of the opposite, which is snob value. Like, I got a library. What about you? Do you have a library? No. Oh, well, there we are. And I think it can go the other way as well. And I think also it must apply to coinage as well, because I've got considerably more coins than you. So it must be that there's got to be a bit of a social element there. So it can swing both ways. So you've got the nerdy element, which is perhaps where people are, yes, a little bit reluctant to share their sort of obsession with trains or something like that. And then at the other end of it, you've got people who are prepared to kind of preach it from the rooftops that they're refined enough and they're clever enough and they're intelligent enough to have a collection of books in a library, Yeah. And I think that's, so it's a mix, isn't it? It's a contrast. So
there's a bit of discreetness as well, because if you can show off about a library, you don't have to tell anyone what it's worth. Whereas if you might not want to tell everybody that you've got a £250,000 coin collection in your house, or in your bank vault.
You get people who are trying to sort of show off a bit. Yeah. And I'm sure in the world of die-cast, that's the case as well to some extent, where people like to tell the story about the product. Oh, did you know this was Jim Clark's car? He was the one that won the Indy 500. Automatically, something more than other people, and your narrative or your sort of linchpin for that is the model that you got. Put it on your mantelpiece, and you can talk about it. It becomes a conversation point.
Yeah.
So there's lots of things, but I can't get away from this escapism as well. I think there's a lot of escapism where people just want to withdraw into their own space, and they want to get away from it, and they use collecting as their that's their medium, that's their means by which they do that. So again, it's different strokes for different folks, I think.
Yeah. And I think it's something that they have to get exceptional reward from, because the kind of value that they'll invest over time is enormous. I think the average collector will spend something in the region of £15,000, coins significantly higher, up to £75,000 across their collecting. From what we see in that, it's an enormous percentage of your average person's disposable income. And one of the things I think people find fascinating is the difference between the people who buy a multi-million pound coin or car and somebody buying a £10 model or £10 ancient. Are they really that different in your experience?
No, really. It depends how much money you have, because to some people, a £500 coin is just pocket change, and they will get just as much excitement out of it as somebody who spent £10 on a ribbon coin. So I don't think there's a massive difference. The only difference I can think really is that the person with a lot more money is probably buying it with the intention of perhaps selling it in the future and maybe getting their money back, or maybe making a bit of a profit. Whereas someone who's spending £10 would be in a bit of a dream world if they thought they were going to be able to flip it and make a load of money, unless they were really looking for that bargain. And that's something else I think people really enjoy, is finding a good deal, or finding, feeling that they've got something for a good price, ideally less than they'd hoped to pay for it. That's always enjoyable, speaking from experience and all sorts of things.
And I think, we had a note in our discussion points about this, and so I'm sure we're going to come back to it, but I think that some people think they're not collecting, they're investing. And this is something that I think will be worth something one day. And whether they get it right or not, only time will tell. But I think there are some people out there that do it deliberately because they think,
oh, for sure,
this is going to be a good area for me to do. I'm not sure that's the case with coin collecting.
And we have to say, if someone, we get people all the time saying, is this a good investment? Will it go up in value? I say, well, I can't predict the future. You have to buy something for a price that you think is reasonable and that you're happy with. And yes, it's not going to become worth nothing. And it's, in my opinion, a relatively safe place to put your money. But I certainly wouldn't go offering financial advice and suggesting that everybody spent all of their money on ancient coins, because you have to make informed decisions.
I totally concur. And I think some people, maybe coins is one area that is peculiar in that respect, because everybody knows what a coin is worth when they get some change in their pocket. So at that time, there's always a true value for that. There's, what do they call it in the stock market? Well, they call it market efficiency. And I guess with bullion, particularly when you buy sovereigns or you're buying, sterling equivalent, there's always going to be a bullion value as well as the numismatic. So you've got a bench to work on straight away.
Well, this is what's really, sorry to interrupt, but this is what's really interesting. The price of gold is so high at the moment, as we know, it's ridiculous. And what that's done is it's outstripped the collectible value of so many historic sovereign coins, particularly Victorian shield backs with the shield on the back. They used to be £350, £400 when gold was £200.
Yeah.
Now gold's, I don't know, 500, and they are selling for gold price. So they're technically really good value because it's weird. The collectible value's just been outstripped. So they're now the same value as any other piece of gold. It's very strange. But that, of course, doesn't apply to ancients because they're basically artefacts. And the gold metal value has no relation to the collectability.
And so really we're saying here that for something like the ancients, you can buy it as an investment, but buy something that you'll enjoy owning.
Exactly. And you might find in 10 years' time, oh, great, it's gone up in value. Great, look, I've built this collection of 50 coins and I've been quite careful about it. I've made sure I've bought really good quality stuff. And excellent. The market has moved. There's been a lot of interest in Roman coins because there's been Gladiator 3 and everyone's really excited and the Roman coins are really, really in at the moment and popular. And the price has gone up a bit. But ancient coins they don't shoot up in value. Yeah, they're doing well at the moment. But they don't, these are slow moving, they're quite liquid in the sense that they can be sold quite easily through a number of different platforms. But they're not the kind of things that shoot up and down like Bitcoin or anything else. They're very they're collectibles. And the value is in what other people deem they're worth. You have to have a strong collector base to do that.
Yeah, and I guess do you think there's a big difference, isn't there, between a fad and enduring demand and interest? And I'd imagine that in the ancient coins era, I don't know the market at all well, but my understanding would be is that there's always going to be an undercurrent of people thinking, look, this was minted in the 3rd century BC, and that's got a great story around it, so it's interesting in its own right. And actually, there's only 500 in existence in the world, so there's a rarity value that comes with that sort of age. So there's that enduring factor.
Yeah.
Whereas I think some people are probably, when it comes to collecting modern toys, I suspect are placing bets.
Really? Yeah.
I think so.
How did she get the Beanie Baby boom?
This happened during COVID with modern issues. There were certain people from certain countries in the world who were spending incredible amounts of money on limited edition stuff that had relatively low mintages. And yes, it was a fad. The prices shot up and then they came right back down again. And that's modern, and we don't really do modern here. But that's the kind of thing that can happen. It happened with Pokémon, but I was pretty sure when it all went pretty crazy around COVID, that it was going to come off the boil and drop, and it hasn't really. And what we're seeing, I don't know if you've seen the videos recently of all the crazy people in America or wherever, ripping things off the shelves and climbing over each other to buy this stuff. It's still really popular
because it's paper, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's just bits of paper, really. And how do people then transmit that into a perception of value?
But it's the nostalgia factor, isn't it? And it's people my age in their early 30s some of whom have been made incredibly wealthy through Bitcoin investments, but a lot of them have decided to sell a lot of their digital currency and then invest it into Pokemon or even watches. There were certain auction websites where you could spend Bitcoin on watches. And as the price of Bitcoin kind of dropped a little bit, the price of watches went up because people were selling their Bitcoins to buy watches. And the price of Bitcoin went down. The price of watches, yeah.
Watches went crazy during lockdown.
Yeah, they went absolutely mad. I mean, remember, you couldn't get anything.
Coming back to your point about the Pokemon seeming to buck the trend of the boom and disappear, which we do see happen. Do you think this is partly to do with the fact that they seem to make a conscious attempt to keep it relevant for each new generation that comes through? So it started out 30 years ago with a game and a cartoon which was targeted at a young audience, obviously, and they've maintained that. So everybody coming through maybe pulls on that same kind of nostalgic vibe.
Pokemon did have a boom and bust. It was massive, absolutely massive when I was in primary school, and then it came off the boil, and then there were all sorts of things that happened behind the scenes, and then the card game bubbled away for 15 years. Yeah, what felt like 15 years, and then And it was really only sort of before COVID where suddenly, with the assistance of some very well-known YouTubers, drove the prices up of cards that had been issued before, drove the price of sealed products. People were buying this stuff and keeping it in its box, it must happen all the time with die-cast models, keeping them in the boxes. And the prices were just going absolutely crazy. They had a sort of boom and bust, and now it just seems like it's never ending. I almost thought they'd produced too much. I thought they'd produced too much in the wake of that massive COVID boom, and that perhaps they would oversaturate the market. And that doesn't really seem to have happened. It's very odd. But I think it just shows what a massive, massive franchise Pokemon is. It's just enormous. And there will always be collectors. And there will also be people like me. There'll be cohorts of people who would happily buy into things if the price dropped. So if the price does come down a little bit, you're going to have loads of people who are going to go, right, that's too cheap now, I better buy some of stuff on the secondary market, that is.
I think it's an interesting point, isn't it, about cohorts? Because we observe this at Corgi. You know, there's no doubt in our mind that there are certain cohorts of customers, you know, certain categories of customer who are going to be very, very interested in a certain age of product or a certain story behind a car or a model from a certain time. And for other customers, it just is no interest at all. So, you know, the cohort management is a very important part of any kind of brand that considers itself to be in the world of collecting or collectors. And we are, you know, originally Corgi was just a toy brand. You know, they had no intention of becoming, you know, collectors or a collectible business. But of course, in time, we've migrated and we've become exactly that. And we don't really create that many models for children anymore. And obviously when we do, we're delighted because it means that we're bringing new people, you know, it's entry-level products, fantastic. But more often than not, we're dealing with people who've already been triggered by something.
And that personal nostalgia was the standout motivation. 85% of the respondents were either important or incredibly important in the reason they go on to buy the next and the next. And I think on Corgi, there was a particular example where two brothers collected in their childhood. One of them went his separate ways. I think the person in question mentioned that they found other hobbies, sports girls, and they dropped their collection. The other brother decided to maintain his. They went into a box, they went into the loft, and then they kind of reconnected and rebonded decades later in their adulthood, where somebody commented, I wish I'd kept hold of mine. And all of a sudden, lo and behold, it emerges from the loft in a dusty box. And they spend an afternoon exchanging models so they can build the collection that they feel represents what they'd like now. I thought that was a fascinating insight into the world of specifically the Corgi collectibles.
Yeah, and I think, you know, for us, one of the big things that really matters to us is what's the story. And of course, it happens at two levels. You've got what's the story that's pertinent for you as an individual. You know, what does that model mean to you? But there's also the secondary story, which is what does it mean as an item of, you know, historical interest. And I think we really believe that there has to be a double narrative actually for us. You know, it's very important that we do product that we think has some kind of historical, cultural recognition for people, because then that automatically helps us to sort of hook up with them. We call them burrs in a way. You know, it's those things that you get when you go for a walk in the country and they sort of stick onto your jersey. Those sort of burrs are very important. So they make a cultural connection. And then there's the personal story, which is, you know, what does that particular model mean to you? And like I said about, you know, my very first die-cast model was, you know, a Concord. That meant something to me. It meant an awful lot, both in its timing and its you know, form. And I think that's very much the case for a lot of die-cast collectors. And maybe that makes it stand out slightly different from some other areas where it's rarity value that makes people interested, or it's the beauty of them. You know, like a watch, you know, if there's a Patek Philippe, you know, it's only been shown 3 times and it's, you know, in a museum of horology in Geneva, it's going to be priceless, you know. But for other people, there are other drivers, and, you know, again, forget the values. It's what it's worth to you and how it means something to you as a person. And a lot of those models are very beaten up, but they still mean a lot to people.
Building a collection takes a lifetime of passion and dedication. When the time comes to pass it on, whether it's your personal collection or one you've inherited, how can you ensure it finds someone who will treasure it as much as you do? And how can you be certain it achieves its full value? For almost 2 centuries, Stanley Gibbons and Baldwins have been trusted by collectors worldwide to auction their items, including stamps, coins, medals, and trading cards. With free valuations, live auctions in central London, and world-renowned expertise, SGB makes the process seamless and rewarding. Their stunning catalogues and global audience ensure that your collection is always beautifully showcased to passionate bidders hunting for your items. Start your auction journey today by submitting a free valuation request at sgbaldwins.com. The Victoria Cross is Britain's highest military decoration, awarded for exceptional bravery in the face of the enemy. Join Mark Smith, the esteemed medal and militaria expert, often featuring on BBC's Antiques Roadshow, as he brings history to life in his captivating live tour. Recognised globally as a leading authority on the Victoria Cross, Mark delves into its origins, dispels enduring myths, and shares riveting tales of extraordinary heroes. Don't miss this unforgettable journey through courage and sacrifice. Secure your tickets now at marksmithmedals.com. It's very true, and so the emotional connection was one of the top few results as to why people collect, alongside uniqueness or rarity. But what we saw emerge was that it didn't actually matter what you collected or your age group or where you were. These 4 key areas were really common drivers almost across the board, which I thought was fascinating. And is that something you see whether you're at a card convention or an ancient coin show?
Yeah, for sure. I'd say it's sort of 90% nostalgia. Especially with Pokémon. It's interesting, that's a much more recent, it's sort of the last 30 years, isn't it, rather than coins which have been collected for hundreds. It's strange as well, we have people who are nostalgic about buying from Baldwins. We've got people in America who will make a point of coming and buying a coin from us every year when we go to New York or when we go to the A&A. Yeah, so they're like, well, I've always bought a coin from Baldwins for the last 50 years, so I'm going to make sure I come and buy something now. It doesn't really matter what it is. So it's really strange. I can't think anywhere else where that's happened. So it's really strange, but it's great, and yeah, I think nostalgia is a key. You also get gifting, and this is something that I thought was really interesting. Last year, just before Christmas, we must have sold more Roman coins than we've sold since I've been here in 8 years, and they were all less than £250. And it must have been because of Gladiator 2, massive film, epic. We were getting phone calls. Oh, do you have any Roman coins? And they were selling faster than we could list them. And it hasn't really happened before, and it's still happening. Roman silver coins, less than £250, are really, really popular. And I wonder whether that's happened in your sort of world. I mean, I think of Drive to Survive with Formula One, and how Formula One was basically nothing before that for about 10 years. And then Drive to Survive on Netflix, and then bang, suddenly everyone wants Formula One again. Lego are doing Formula One.
And it's the same for us with Bond. Is every 4 years they produce Bond film. You'll see it in our sales figures. You see an uptick in particularly, the original silver Bond car, because these days it makes an appearance every time now. They wheel it out. And
any insider knowledge on the next Bond? Have they told you whose face to put on the man behind the wheel?
No, even if I knew, I couldn't tell you because I'm under an NDA. And I'd be sued. And, we would be then in breach of contract, which we really don't want because we have a great relationship with them. And it goes back 60 years now. So it has to be looked after. But yes, you're absolutely right. If we get wind of something from them and we know it's going to happen, that gives us time to then go away and prepare for it, and get it right.
And the gifting it's a gift that keeps on going. 30% of respondents said that they started, even if it was in their youth, they started with a gift. It's a huge proportion of collectors.
Yeah, and I think actually, cars is one of those areas that's very much in Corgi's DNA. And you look at all the die-cast models, and cars is a real mainstream or main part of their range. And it's one of those things that really does help with cohort management as well. So we do a lot of Ford cars actually for our customers, and the evolution has been fascinating. Okay, so 5 or 6 years ago, the emphasis was very much on things like Ford Capris, Mark 1 Cortinas, Mark 1 Escorts, yeah, and then now we're seeing a lot more interest in the cars from the 80s and the 90s. So the Cosworths and the XR2i, Mark 2s, Mark 3s. So it starts to be a program then that you can then understand more about the needs and demands of different cohorts of customers, and they say, right, okay, we know that they want these things, so let's do it. But cars has always been a very, very strong area, and it's because people use cars, don't they? I mean, almost everybody either drives a car. How many people have driving license in the country? So the experience of driving a car is much more commonplace and therefore much more emotionally charged. Nostalgia is very important. My first car, wow, I'd love to have a die-cast model of my first car. And so that kind of connection is very, very important. Whereas it's different with aircraft. For instance, I mean, how many people have got private or CPLs? It's like, it's a fraction of the population, and therefore it's quite difficult to be nostalgic about that. So you have to then depend on a completely different narrative and different story to trigger those, like I said, those sticky burrs that get people excited and engaged in a particular, genre or subgenre or a sub-subgenre.
After that kicks off and somebody starts collecting, how big a collection would I know average is a terrible term to use, but your average Corgi collector, hundreds?
Oh yeah.
And would that be the same for coins?
It's more than that, because coins are tiny. I think that's something people do say, is actually you can fit a £500,000 coin collection into a small box, whereas presumably a £500,000 Corgi collection would probably take a garage.
I mean, look at Bernie Eccleston. He's had to sell his cars, hasn't he? Because he got so many of them, and he's like run out of space, and that's it. He's got to get rid of them. With us, one of the biggest reasons why people say they can't continue their collections because they've run out of space. And it's either them, or it's their collection that has to go. So it's like, okay, the collection goes.
You're suggesting someone else might have sort of outside influence?
I think so, and I think it is also this is the life stage thing, and I think you picked up in the research, didn't you, about the thinning process. When you have to start
to focus down on,
you get saturation, and you think, okay, well, you've got to start refocusing. But of course, people go through different phases, and like I have with collecting die-cast or with watches, is that what you like at the beginning ain't the same as what you like now, and it can be driven by affluence, it can be driven by volumetric constraints, or it can be driven by other things. And I think it's that really is something that is just down to the individual. But as a rule of thumb, I think one of the biggest reasons why die-cast has a problem is because it's a 3D model, it's heavy. And the planes in particular, some of the aircraft that we do, they're 1/48 scale, and they're that big.
Mm-hmm.
And, really,
and run out of shelves quite soon.
Yeah, or even roof space.
Yeah. We have something else where people will improve the quality of the coins they have. So they might start off, and this is something I always say to people, just buy the best condition you possibly can, because otherwise in 5 years' time, you're going to come to me and say, oh, well, I wish I hadn't bought 50 of these. I wish I'd just bought one. And people will start to sell the lower grade pieces to then be able to upgrade and afford more. So I don't know whether the curve is different for coins in that perhaps it lasts, I don't know, perhaps the peak lasts a bit longer because people start to thin the collection down to improve the quality. But I suppose it depends from person to person, depending on income. Like you said, people can.
And it's really interesting how they keep track of it, because we've spoken about really understanding your collection deeply and what you want to replace and upgrade at any given point. You've talked about the sheer volume of material that you can amass over a lifetime of collecting, but only 1 in 5 keep track of it in what we'd call a meaningful way. You do get some people making notes in notebooks, and some people will think, I've got a rough idea of what I have, maybe 20% don't care, don't want to.
My grandfather had quite a large stamp collection, and it was a lifetime pursuit. So he's left, I'd say probably about 5 or 6 boxes behind, and actually almost all of it was beautifully catalogued, except for the last box, which, because he ran out of road, he died before he had a chance to catalogue it. So all the other ones are beautifully catalogued in his, lovely copper plate sort of, Edwardian writing. And then I've got a load of other stuff that's left from the end that's uncatalogued, which one day I'll probably try and do it myself. But I think stamps is unusual, I think, in that area, I suspect. And particularly when it comes to things like coins or watches, maybe because there aren't so many of them, you don't need to catalogue it. You kind of got it all in your head.
Yeah, I think there are some. I think more recent coins where there is one for every single date, or little sub varieties. Coin collecting can become a lot like stamp collecting. Yeah. But with the older stuff, someone may have. One thing I see all the time is someone's got a big list of Roman emperors, and they just tick them off as they go. Right, I need Trajan, Hadrian, Nero, whatever, and then they'll just go through it.
It's dangerous when you're a collector, isn't it?
It is.
Because there's always a space.
And then they get to the end and they realize actually a coin of Romulus Augustulus, the last Roman emperor, even in terrible condition, is 20 grand. And then they go, oh my goodness, what am I going to do?
Which is interesting. I spoke to somebody here, and I think this is a point you're about to make about there always being a space. Yeah. Spoke to somebody who kind of explained that it was, in their opinion, a collection is defined by what's missing, rather than an accumulation. It's like not about the number of things you have; it's about the things you're trying to get hold of, and those empty spots.
This is the unhappiness side. It's this the flip side of the coin, isn't it? It's a horrible thing to have your nose intellectually pressed up against the glass, looking at that item that you can't have yet.
So how do you cope with that? With something like, say, the Ardmore, the most famous ancient coin, multiple millions for a genuine, and there's only one or two. So how do people deal with having that spot missing in their book?
Well, they have to buy a replica. Yeah, they have to buy a pretty good replica, or they will never. Yeah, though, except they'll never have one. We had a plated copy of one, and even that went for £25,000. This is a coin that's worth well over £250,000, and so someone had to settle for the copy from the time. But I've been looking for a UFO token, one of these. They're brilliant. I'll show you. They're these tokens from France in the 17th century, and they depict something that looks like a UFO over the fields, and they're bizarre. And they're not really UFOs, but I've wanted one for 8 years, probably longer actually, and I finally got one last week. But it was only £30. So this is the problem. You have this situation where in coins where something might actually not be worth that much, but because it's so rare and no one else cares about it, it can be years, decades before you even see one. So it doesn't really matter how much money you've got. You may still not be able to get a certain coin, which is why when things do appear, particularly on the higher end, you can get some incredible prices reached because you've got two people who really, really want it.
We had a bit of a run recently because we relaunched the Batmobile. Okay, so the original Corgi Toys Batmobile came from 1966, and it's enormously charismatic as a toy anyway. So it's a wonderful thing in its own right. But the other thing is there's been a lot of pent-up demand over time because people can't afford them. If you go to an antiquarian equivalent seller of, vintage Corgi toys, or we go to an auction, they can change hands for about 1,500 quid. Yeah. If it's in a good box, doesn't have to be a perfect box. If it's in a good box and it's in very good condition, not mint, they go for over 1,000. So of course there's a lot of pent-up demand for people who can't afford that, but they want a pristine model from Corgi. So it's not a replica. We call them reissues, which does drive some people crazy in my little morbid. But I think it is a proper reissue. Every time Omega reproduce their space watch, it's a reissue. It's and
they made it pretty well.
Yeah, and they, of course, they make them with different elements to it and slightly different face, slightly different design elements, slightly different working movement, but at the end of the day it's a reissue, and it comes from the parent company. It doesn't come from another company. It comes from Omega, in the same way that when we reissued the Batmobile, it's legit, and we use the tooling, so it's all there, so it's pure, but it's just not one from not from the class of 66.
And do you think those will always retain their higher value?
The class of 66 probably will. Well, certainly until time ends. I think so that'll be in about 30 years' time, and then after that I won't care. But I think, yes, there are certain elements that will endure always. And it's the same with other forms of collectible, which is why coins are so collectible, I'm sure, because they endure forever. People talk about stamps running out of road, don't they? And I'm not sure about that. I think as long as stamps are stamps, people are going to collect them.
They say it about coins as well, with cashless society and all the rest of it. But that might be a while away. I mean, the Royal Mint is still producing pennies and 2p.
Yeah.
And secondly, with the ancients, at least, they're artefacts. They will always be collectible because they, a lot of people think, well, why is that not in a museum? Yeah. And you say, well, actually, the museum's got one already.
Yeah.
But people see them in a different light.
But conversely, with the demise of coin, don't people then become even more, certainly in our lifetime, they'll become more nostalgia? That's a good point. Yeah. And I think that's the case about cars. As we move towards, having cars that almost all kind of look the same, they certainly sound the same. And to all intents and purposes, a battery. The personality leaves the car when you start having battery cars. And we think there's a good logic to it, which is that people are going to become much more nostalgic about the cars that they owned when they were younger, that did sound different and that were different, a V8.
Yeah.
I mean, in 30 years' time, there'll be people that will have never heard a V8 engine.
This very much,
which I think is a shame. That's a crying shame, because somebody needs to hear what a V8 sounds like. And I think when you buy a Mustang, a model of a Mustang V8, for people that know, they'll go, oh yeah, that's a great car. Or a Dodge Charger, or a Camaro. It's like, okay, there's something very, very emotional about that. And I think as time passes and maybe those things get kind of pushed off into the dustbin of history, actually people become even more nostalgic about them. I think
sentiments echoed by Harvey from RM Sotheby, and we had a very similar conversation about the move to EV and more specifically about driverless cars. And does less interaction during your youth mean that you could see that phasing out as well? And actually, we learned the fact that it's probably just going to change the reasons why nostalgia becomes more important.
Funny that, isn't it? It's a small, because we were talking about this, and he said that the technology is now there and it's going to be embedded within our lifetimes. And there'll be people in 50 years' time that go, do you know what? People used to drive their own cars. They had a license. That's crazy. It's going to be like that, isn't it? You had a steering wheel. Wow, you're actually in control of these things. That's incredible. They let you do that. So I think there's trying to predict the nostalgia of the future. I think for me, it's a fool's errand, actually. I mean, trying to choose the future is difficult, but I think enduring passions and interests will always sell, I think. And that's why coins sell. And I hope that die cuts continues to sell. As long as there are things worth making and replicating in metal, I'm hoping that there will be people out there that want to buy it.
And to tie in something that you'd mentioned a couple of times, you'd both discussed, is along with all of those key drivers is that overarching escapism that collectibles will and can continue, whichever category it is, to provide. It's a really common thread through much of our feedback from collectors was the fact that it provides that ability to spend that little bit of time alone, escape from the world around them, and focus on something that was meaningful to them personally.
Men are from Mars, women are from Venus. And in that book, they say that men in their kind of traditional capacity are trying to escape from the world. So they want to retreat to their shed. And I think that's where collectibles become the ideal kind of partner to that kind of escapism, because you can just retreat somewhere with a book, a model, a stamp collection, a coin collection, and just for 1 minute, you can forget about all the trials and tribulations in the world. So I think there is very much this sort of sense of, escapism, but it's obviously the emotional triggers are completely different. So that's almost like a symptom, is the escapism, but it manifests itself that way. And I think how many men retreat to the garden shed and actually, get their books out and I just have a quick read while they're supposed to be mowing the grass, and I think it's universal.
So do you find that with coin collecting as well? It seems really consistent across the board. Like over half people say it's about a reward. It's about time to myself.
It is, yes, but also it's. I don't know how most of your sales are done. I presume most of them are probably online, but or are they from like toy shops or model shops? And
the model shops are still really
because
I think of our business.
I think a big part of it is actually going out there, and people will they'll come to Baldwin's as an experience. I've never been a big fan of the whole selling an experience, but they will enjoy coming to London or coming into central London and coming to Baldwin's and looking at some coins for an hour and picking one and buying one and taking it home. I'm not sure how much escapism there is in when they get back, putting it into the coin cabinet and then putting it away. But actually, I think a lot of it is actually great, let's go to Baldwin's or let's go to a coin fair. It's a bit of a treat every couple of months to go to a big coin fair and go around. Not really sure what you're going to find. So I suppose that's also a type of escapism.
It's a funny one, isn't it? Because I think that some pursuits and some hobbies and interests are more social and other ones are more solitary. And maybe that's why some people are a bit more secretive about their, collections, because they know actually it's a very self-indulgent thing and it's not something that's really that interesting to share with other people unless they share that common passion, in which case then it becomes a, potential friendship for life, where you can argue the point about, different types of coin, watch, car, toy, whatever. And then it becomes really interesting. Look at the Top Gear guys. The reason why that was such an enduring and fascinating television program, apart from the fact that they were constantly sort of japing with each other, but was that they all had different opinions about the same cars and different experiences, and then it would become almost like an intellectual discussion about the whys and wherefores of why, a McLaren was better than a Ferrari or a Ferrari was better than a Porsche. And it was all sort of deep grained in their sort of views about life in general. And so it's that sort of combination. Sometimes it's more of a social thing and sometimes it's not. And I think that's where you get big differences. And I think with diecast, it's more of a kind of solitary pursuit until somebody comes into your life that you influence and they pick up the bug, like a grandchild will see, oh, what's this, granddad? And it's like, oh, that is a Ford Cortina Mark 1. I have one of those. And it's like, oh, that's interesting. And then suddenly the grandchild gets given a car and it's like, oh, and then suddenly there's a whole interest that gets triggered from there. But I think a lot of collecting is escapism for solitary purposes, isn't it? It's like escape for its own end, really, to sort of keep your sanity.
So is that where sort of Corgi sort of differs from Skill Electric, I suppose?
Yes, I mean, it's a much more social pursuit. It's actually playing it, isn't it, rather than just collecting it.
Because James May did that Toy Stories program, where he sort of make his opinions known on the kind of nerdy collectors who'd only ever keep things in the box and never actually run them and play with them. But yeah, I suppose it's multifaceted, isn't it? Some people want to keep everything pristine in its box.
I think you have people that will do one of each.
Yeah, I'm guilty of that. I mean, I picked up a Formula One set because it was half price of set of Skill Extras, and it's just gone in the cupboard because it seemed too cheap. And I thought this seems really good, and it's just limited edition and whatever. I'll put it away and see what happens.
Yes. I've got one theme which I think is quite peculiar and quite different from the others, which is buses. Mm-hmm. Okay, buses I think is a really interesting area because what drives people to collect buses can be very, very multi-layered. So some people, they collect because of the story. They think, just the number 3 or the number 73 actually is a very good one, Oxford Street, or the number 9 that went up through Piccadilly, 22. So there's a destination board that means something to you, or it might be an advertisement, Coca-Cola or a big show or something like that. And then there's another angle, which is just that the Route Master is one of the most perfect public transport design pieces ever made. So when you have one in your hands, it's just a superb model. It looks beautiful. It's
the new ones?
No, the old ones.
Yes.
And it's just like, and then you got people who just respond to the story, which is when we did some advertising a long time ago. We had a little subheader which said, "Ding ding, move along inside, please." And of course, that means something to millions of people. So you got that side of it as well, and then there's another bit which is the railway users, people who are into public transport. So they build a train collection of models. They build a fantastic layout, but it's missing something. It's missing buses.
So you do the trackside stuff.
We do.
So
that's right.
Scale stuff.
Yeah,
fits perfectly.
176, and that's why that's a strange one for me because it has so many different facets to it, and I think that's one of the reasons why bus collecting has always been traditionally a very high turnover, more so than perhaps aircraft.
They almost become pieces of scenery.
That's
for a
right.
train set.
Exactly that. Yeah, which is why the scale is very important for them because you can't have a 148 scale bus on a 176 scale layout. It just looks stupid.
So and that just blends so well with being a Hornby. That company, I suppose.
That's what. Yes, and I have a very interesting dialogue all the time with the guy that runs the Hornby brand because actually he's right to be demanding that we reinstate buses and bring them back as a collection because that helps him.
So aside from specifically on specific models, what's coming next for collecting, do you think? From people's feedback, it shows no signs of slowing down. The majority of collectors expect to spend as much next year as they did this year. And every generation coming through is adopting it once more, whether it's Pokémon again, whether it's a new collection each year, more and more people are continuing to come into the hobby. So how do you think it will change? If we start with Hornby.
I think it will change. I think it will change. I think thematically.
Yeah.
It's going to evolve. And I think, we touched on things like Bond, which is actually an enduring theme, but it still gets its spikes and its troughs. So I think for us, when we see a cultural icon that makes a connection with millions of people, and it, at the end of the day, metal is just a format, it's just a medium, like a painting or anything else. And if we can see it being replicated in metal well, if it represents that image well, then we'll have a go at it. And so for us, we're always keeping an eye out for cultural icons, things that, will one day perhaps be of interest. And it's things that will have enduring value as well. So just a one-off is not that interesting for us. But if we can see a theme where there are multiple opportunities for creating new models and things, that's when we get excited. So,
and on coins, is the way can you foresee the way people collect changing?
Not really. I just think it's going to be who collects. And I think a lot of it's going to be down to what happens in the media. I've mentioned it already, but films that are coming out, or particular series that are on television in this. I mean, I'm sure Detectorists and the popularity behind that program, and all the various archaeology programs that have been coming out over the last few years have had a huge impact. And also Hobbies, metal detecting is massive, and you see this shift particularly on Facebook, where you have metal detectorists who are going on Facebook to sell their stuff, who are actually then ending up turning into collectors themselves. And you have a whole another market there, which is sort of confined to the internet.
And so while there's this kind of clamour for online experience, for visualizing, for immersing yourself digitally into new hobbies, are we almost saying here that actually the people that are saying they want to take a break away from the screen, the people that want to spend some time alone away from all that, actually it's a safe haven?
Yeah, with something physical. And actually, the web is a great thing because it's an opportunity for people to share their passions and hobbies. It's a great place for forums where people will share their views on products. I mean, we take a lot of interest in the forums and what they say about our products as a way of improving things. But at the end of the day, you can't download a model, not yet. So having that capacity to be able to make something that people can then enjoy away from the screen, I think is a great thing. It's a great thing, because otherwise the world's just going to end up becoming 2D if we're not careful. Everything's virtual, and it's like, I just don't think that's right. It's not.
No, there was that big fad for NFTs for a while, wasn't there? And that basically didn't really seem to go anywhere.
Yeah, I don't know where that's.
It's not the same. It doesn't matter what anybody says. Doesn't matter what anybody says. You would much rather have a physical piece of art on the wall. You'd much rather have a die-cast model as opposed to something that's been 3D printed and looks similar. But that technology isn't there yet. I'm not sure we'll ever be able to 3D print die-cast. So you've got that amazing quality that you'll never be able. Well, without a lot of heat,
without a lot of energy.
And so collecting's here to stay, and what's more, physical collectibles very much the same.
Hopefully, yes.
Wonderful. Well, thanks very much for joining us, both of you. A quick reminder that we'll be making some announcement very soon about National Collectors Day, and releasing the extended report with our findings from the National Collector Survey in the coming